Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Matthew King. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most famous pieces of music in the world, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and specifically the first movement with its famous rocking triplets, famous for all sorts of reasons, the extraordinary atmosphere that it evokes, and the fact that, rather like For Elisa, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, it's a piece that can be played not just by professional pianists but also by amateur players. But one of the purposes of today's discussion is to discover things about the Moonlight Sonata that are not so familiar, and actually to realise that the piece is in many ways quite different, both in terms of what Beethoven meant by it and even in terms of the way it should be played from the way that it's commonly viewed. So there are all sorts of misconceptions about this piece. So today's discussion is partly a way of showing some of those fascinating differences between what Beethoven originally intended and what people generally think now. So the first thing to talk about is the historical context. Beethoven wrote the Moonlight Sonata right on the cusp of the 19th century. I guess one of the things that fascinates you about Beethoven is that people don't really know his dates, and so how does he fit into history? Well, he was born in 1770, the same year as William Wordsworth, and he died in 1827, and so he's born into the 18th century. He learns his craft as a musician in the 18th century, and even more than that, he went to Vienna from his hometown Bonn in order to study with Mozart. But Mozart died in 1791, and Beethoven ended up having lessons with Haydn. But there's this extraordinary sense that he belonged and knew himself and believed himself to belong within this almost sacred tradition, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. All his life, he knew himself to be the third member of that trinity. Very much an 18th century context, Viennese classical context. And that's really important to bear in mind for the Moonlight Sonata, which in a sense grows out of that tradition. So here we are, 1800 is the year, the new century has begun. Beethoven is going deaf, he's aware of it, he's hearing buzzing sounds, he can't hear distant sounds, and it's causing him great distress because as a professional musician, in those days, if you started to go deaf, you were really sunk. And even now, it's no fun being a professional musician with hearing problems. So he was horrified, terrified to discover that this was beginning to happen. 1801, he was also writing a ballet called The Creatures of Prometheus. That was the big project. But in his spare time, he composed two sonatas, which are the 13th and 14th sonatas in his output. So the piano sonata, early in Beethoven's career, was absolutely the career-defining genre of his life. It was piano sonatas that defined him and that made him famous in Vienna and in Europe generally because they were so extraordinary. He learned to master the medium by the time he was 25 with his Opus 2 sonatas that he dedicated to Haydn, and then he just rattled through these extraordinary pieces, the Opus 10 sonatas, the Pathétique sonata, right up to here where we are today, the 13th and 14th sonatas, which he called, so he didn't call this piece Moonlight Sonata, he called it Sonata Quasi Una Fantasia. There are two Quasi Una Fantasia sonatas, this is the second one. What did he mean by that title? Well, it's highly experimental. The 12th sonata in A-flat major, he'd already experimented with the idea of having a sonata in which none of the movements are in sonata form, and the third one is a funeral march. So there's something quite strange and experimental going on. He's kind of rethinking the whole genre. And then with the two Quasi Una Fantasia sonatas, the idea was, I think, to really experiment with form itself. Beethoven was famous both as a master of classical sonata form, but he was also famous as an improviser. And so he's putting together the two ideas, the idea of improvisation, of freedom, in other words, of rhapsodic creativity, and the idea of strict form. It's as if you can combine the two. And because he was so masterful at form in general, he kind of worked out how he might do it. In both sonatas, the real power and intellectual focus of the sonata is in the finale, which itself is a radical thing to do. Both sonatas have a big sonata form finale, fast and difficult. In this one, the Moonlight Sonata, you have a slow, mysterious first movement, a minuet in the middle, and then the prestissimo finale. So there's a sort of acceleration from slow to middle paced to super fast. And the first movement itself is this kind of rhapsodic invention, completely extraordinary. And he instructs the pianist, I'm not very good at Italian, but I'll read what he writes over the score. Si deve suonare tutto questo pezzo delicatessimamente a senza sordini. In other words, the whole piece should be played with the utmost delicacy and without dampers, without mutes, sordini. The mutes being the dampers on the piano that are, on a modern piano, lifted off the strings by putting the pedal down. And he repeats the instruction between the staves. It says sempre pianissimo e senza sordini. Always pianissimo, always quiet, very quiet, and without mutes. Now, on a fortepiano of Beethoven's time, which was a very, very different instrument from a modern piano, the sonority of the instrument was very different. It was much less resonant. The sound of the strings died away much quicker. You activated the dampers by pressing a knee lever rather than a foot pedal, which you do on a modern piano. So pianists nowadays play the beginning of the Moonlight Sonata, and very often they play it terribly slowly, like this, and then they change pedal there when the harmony changes, and so forth. Often so slowly that it really doesn't resemble what Beethoven intended. And the actual tempo he intended was much closer to this, and the sound would slightly blur from one harmony to the next. It would blur simply because Beethoven has instructed the pianist to keep the dampers off for the duration of the piece. The fascinating thing is that on the fortepiano, the instrument he intended it to be played on, that creates this wonderful poetic effect where each harmony dissolves into the next one. There's a sort of merging of one change of harmony with the next. This beautiful sense, almost cloudy, impressionistic quality. The harmonies change almost imperceptibly. Hard to describe, but at the end of this presentation, there'll be a recording of me playing it on a fortepiano that's very kindly been donated anonymously to the channel, and you'll hear the effect of that pedal. So forward wind to that moment if you want to. But as far as Beethoven's intention is concerned, it was the fortepiano and the dissolving harmonies and a quicker tempo that we're used to today. The next thing is the title itself. The Moonlight Sonata is not a title that Beethoven knew. It didn't exist in his lifetime. And although the piece was an enormous hit, pretty much from publication onwards, Czerny, a composer who was also Beethoven's pupil, reported to Beethoven, I think in 1802, that the sonata was immensely popular. And in later years, Beethoven was very resentful about the popularity of the piece because it rather eclipsed his later music. He went on to write many more sonatas, many of which he prized much higher than the Moonlight, and so it irritated him that people were obsessed with this one piece. But back to the title. The title actually comes from the 1840s when a poet called Ludwig Rellstab wrote a poem in which he drew the analogy between this music and a moonlit lake, a boat on Lake Lucerne in Switzerland by moonlight. And this very poetic image kind of took off and people began to associate the poem with the piece. And so Moonlight became the kind of nickname of the piece. But if you look at the manuscript, or even on a modern edition, there's no mention of Moonlight on the title because it doesn't exist. It's not what Beethoven intended. So what was the poetic thinking? I mean, is it just an abstract piano piece or did Beethoven have something in mind? Well, here's an interesting thing. Edwin Fischer, the famous pianist, I believe in the 40s, found a sketch that Beethoven had made of the opening material of the sonata, the famous triplet figure. And on the same page of the sketchbook, he noticed that Beethoven had transcribed a passage from Mozart's Don Giovanni. Mozart had written Don Giovanni in the 1780s, so almost 20 years earlier. And it's fascinating how Beethoven always has his sights on Mozart. Mozart is like the great composer in a sense that Beethoven wants to be. He was brought up, his father tried to pass him off as a child prodigy and pretended his age was younger than it was, in order that the child, Beethoven, as a pianist, could appear to be like Mozart. So he always lived in Mozart's shadow, and he always felt throughout his life that he hadn't had the advantages that Mozart had had. Mozart's father looked after him and toured all over Europe with him and made a big fuss of him, whereas Beethoven's father was an alcoholic and a bit of a charlatan. And these issues, Beethoven always felt that he'd come from behind. Anyway, Don Giovanni was an opera that absolutely thrilled the young Beethoven when he heard it. He was also horrified by what he considered to be its lascivious theme. The idea of the rakish aristocrat who goes around in the opera seducing women. Kind of shocking. The character Don Giovanni was modelled on Casanova, a contemporary aristocrat, who was in the audience at the first performance. And Mozart has this rakish guy carrying on throughout the opera with various people swearing revenge. And at the end, he's dragged down to hell by the statue of the commendatore, who's somebody he's murdered in the first scene. Now, the death of the commendatore in the first scene of the opera was a scene that Beethoven admired so much that he wrote it out in his notebook. And in a minute, I'll play you the passage with voices so you can hear the context. It's actually a trio, the dying commendatore singing about how his life is ebbing away, Don Giovanni, who's just killed him with a sword, and is saying, oh, the silly fool, what a rash idiot. His life is draining away. And then Leporello, the servant of Don Giovanni, saying, oh, heavens, this is terrible, my master's murdered someone. So you have this very dramatic trio going on. But behind the trio, the accompaniment is doing this. Bear the Moonlight Sonata in mind when I play this. So you've got the violins playing these triplet figures. Circling around. That's very characteristic, isn't that extraordinary? So that wonderful use of the Neapolitan. Da, 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 da. The Neapolitan is just a semitone above the tonic, and it gives that lovely harmonic shift. So that's the famous and marvellous death scene from scene 1 of Don Giovanni, the death of the commendatore. Now, just have a listen to the recording of that so you hear the voices. It doesn't really sound like the Moonlight Sonata at all when you hear it in context, but hearing me play it at the piano, you can see where Beethoven got the idea from. So, having listened to the Mozart, back to Beethoven's Moonlight, Beethoven begins the sonata with this famous opening. C sharp minor, the pedal, the bass drops a tone, and immediately you're in A, and then the Neapolitan, the chord that Mozart used so beautifully, and Beethoven's flagrantly copying him. The Moonlight has this beautiful, poetic beginning, but it's sort of derived from scene 1 of Don Giovanni. The Neapolitan, and then the cadence. And then, over the top, here comes the melody. Now, we've established that the triplet accompaniment probably owes its origins to Mozart's Don Giovanni. The next thing is this famous rhythm. You've got the triplets, but then you've got this single note, the dun dun dun. It's so compelling, isn't it? The single note and the rhythm, the dotted rhythm, which is slightly at odds with the triplet rhythm. Very interesting. If you go back to Beethoven's previous sonata, Opus 26 in A flat major, and the third movement of that piece is this. So it's a funeral march, and it has that same rhythm with the same repeating note in dotted rhythm. So isn't it fascinating? Here's Beethoven apparently combining scene 1 of Don Giovanni with a funeral march rhythm that he'd already experimented with in the previous sonata. And you have in that melding together of those two musical topics, those tropes, the idea of mortality and death and something actually very gloomy, which seems to be being suggested by the music, the combination of a sort of funeral march and then the triplet rhythm of the death scene in Don Giovanni. Interestingly, Carl Czerny, who I've mentioned earlier, the composer Carl Czerny, also a pupil of Beethoven's, he commented a few years after the piece was published that it was for him, and possibly he'd been talking to Beethoven since they were friends, it was a ghost scene, he said. It's a ghost scene in which plaintive, distant voices call from far away. And you can hear this sort of plaintive character, the single note over the top of the rocking accompaniment. And later on in the second subject, or I'm calling it the second subject, the second primary melodic idea, which is in E minor, this marvellous dissonant effect of the C against the B and then the A sharp against the B. But there's something wonderfully plaintive and lamenting about these sighing patterns and the dissonances that Beethoven creates. Marvellous, unprecedentedly dissonant writing. You don't really think about the Moonlight being a dissonant piece, but Beethoven explores all sorts of adventurous harmonic ideas in terms of expressivity. So we've talked about lament and we've talked about ghosts and so on. It's intriguing that the dedicatee, famously, was a woman with whom Beethoven was in love, Countess Julie Guicciardi, celebrated, beautiful, young Italian aristocrat who'd come to Vienna. Beethoven was giving her piano lessons because he was a celebrated pianist. He may have proposed marriage to her, we don't know. Quite soon afterwards, she married another, more eligible musician who was also an aristocrat. Beethoven was not aristocratic. And besides, he was ill, he was deaf, he was eccentric and difficult. And so generally unlucky in love. Whether the sonata's gloomy, death-like quality is in fact not so much a romantic declaration as a sort of, this is how I feel then, let it be, as if our relationship is dead, or something to that effect, I don't know. And I'm fancifully speculating. But there is certainly a hint of darkness and morbidity about the Moonlight Sonata. And as far as the great first movement is concerned, you've got the two principal subjects that I've mentioned, both of which have this plaintive quality. In the middle of the movement, there's this marvellous sort of what might be described as a development section, all over a G sharp, a dominant pedal. Again, voices calling, a high voice and a low voice. And then these marvellous cross-rhythmic 1 2 1 2 1 2 against the prevailing triplet rhythm. Each harmony becoming more tense than the one before. This magnificent arching diminished seventh, and then the thumb, which Beethoven marks with crotchets, coming in like a low voice at the end. Wonderfully turning it to the Neapolitan D natural. Isn't that extraordinary? And then, rather like the Don Giovanni scene 1, the music comes round to the tonic and the recapitulation. And then in the recap, the other lamenting tune returns like a second subject would normally, this time in C sharp major, the tonic major. And then at the end, the cross-rhythmic stuff from the development section is going on. The funereal melody is in the bass in the left hand for the first time. And so the whole form flows through in this absolutely inexorable perfectly judged way. It's the kind of piece you can't imagine anyone composing, because you can't imagine anyone making the decision to go, oh, let's go to this harmony instead of this one. And yet that's presumably what Beethoven did. Great improviser that he was, you can hear the structure apparently forming itself around classical sonata form in a kind of loose sense, but unfolding absolutely as if it's a fantasia, as if it's being improvised in the moment. And then as it draws to conclusion in the depths of the piano, because of course the piano of Beethoven's day wasn't as low as a modern piano, but right at the bottom of the piano of his time, you should then move directly into the second movement without a pause. He instructs the pianist to continue. So that's another reason why it's quasi Una Fantasia. The entire sonata should be played without a break between the movements. You're now about to hear the recording of me playing the first movement only, not the second or the third movement. Perhaps in future videos we'll look at those. Just the first movement on a fortepiano. Enjoy.